And we're live now. Hello, welcome to Post Tech Radio. This is our fourth episode. I've been looking forward to this one for a while. I initially decided to get into this kind of thing as opposed to just starting a tiny letter or what's the other one, Substack, like everyone has, because we were talking about this a moment ago. Prepping is hard, or rather, like prep looks different for different people. And I would much rather show up to a meeting, a one-on-one, where you can just chat and let stuff happen free flow. And I've been happy to plan the more topic-driven episodes up to this point, but I've been looking forward to just chilling out with Tatiana. Today we have Tatiana Mac, an American software engineer, open source maintainer, and one of the folks I am most flattered follows me back on Twitter. One of the first people I had in mind
Same.
to, thanks. One of the first folks I thought about reaching out to when this project got started, and well, that was embarrassing and awful. It was embarrassing and awful. I'm having Wi-Fi issues today. I apologize if that happens again. We're just going to have to hang in there as best as possible. Um, as I was saying, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm excited to be done with the metaphoric capitalist drone week.
You mentioned earlier that you felt good because you had a capitalistically productive morning, and now you get to finish off the afternoon with something ostensibly a little less so. Um, then we were talking for a second about I don't know, why does it feel so good to do a good job in terms of making other people money? I mean, making yourself money, making yourself survival, sure, but I don't know that identity piece of I feel good when my bosses tell me I did a good job. I feel good when I get a nice title besides my name, and I hate that, but I do.
Yeah. Yeah. And even that phrase, like we use it a lot, good job, is kind of weird, right? Like
Good
we're
job,
like,
good worker.
well, yeah, good job. And then job also means two things. Like it means like the job that you did, but also means like the title that you give yourself. And that we like are conditioned in at least American public schooling to like want a good job on our paper. It's like, what about like,
Right.
I don't know. I was telling, this is kind of a subject change, but I was telling somebody that it's kind of weird that we don't like greet each other with, and maybe in some cultures that I'm not aware of this happens, but with like, congratulations for surviving.
Right. I mean,
Congratulations for being here.
in some of my smaller queer circles, that is often how it is. It's like, how are you doing considering everything's terrible, or you made it through a week, go you. But yeah, good job is like the meets expectations of life. Like
Yes.
you did a job is a thing you're supposed to do. So if you do a good job, at like minimum, you did the thing you were supposed to do. We say that for everything. Like, man, this
Well,
pregnancy was really hard, but I'm glad I got through it. Good job.
well, and even I'm obsessed with binaries, or rather fighting them.
Right.
But the idea of like you either did a good job or you did a bad job, and it's like, what if you did the job, like done job,
Done job.
or not done job? There,
Check.
like, see if you want to have a binary, it's like done job.
Sure. Yeah, take out the like you didn't do this job versus you did the job. We don't care how well you did it.
And that's your opinion. Like whether it's done or not is sure, it can be a spectrum as well, but like it's a little bit
Right.
more provable. But good or bad job, it's like maybe you just don't like me and you just don't want to tell me good job.
if it's not provable, then we have an issue with the initial metrics, right? You didn't define what a job done looked like, so can't say whether it's done or not, good or bad.
And like I know we're joking around, but this is kind of the fundamental problem with a lot of communication is not
Sure,
defining words or
sure.
not agreeing upon words.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the like that word was made up. Oh, like the words that we plucked off the word tree that has been here since time immemorial. Well,
The
I mean,
yeah.
go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you. Oh,
That idea of words being made up as a retort is like so funny to me because yeah, like to your point about the tree, it's like every literally every single word has been made up. And sure, some of them were made up a little bit earlier than others, but like do we at what date cutoff is a word graduated into um being accepted?
right.
Right? Like is it 100 years? Is it 200 years?
Sure. Um, and I think, I mean, going back to this, like the root of embodied etymology, you see a thing, you point at it, and you want to talk about it. So we do that for the okay, ground, sky, like earth, me, you, like those things got sorted a while ago. And now we're like, we are creating knowledge. We're creating a lot of knowledge currently. People are creating knowledge about themselves, not having knowledge created about them. Finding labels that describe who they are in like a positive rather than a negative way. And it must be an interesting thing. I mean, it is an interesting thing from my perspective to live through. Other people who are like, those words are made up, that gender is made up. They're also living through that. They experience that in a much different way, of course.
I think that the idea that calling things made up is an insult. Ugh. Because it's like, yes, of course it is. It all is. And so then what binary are we working with? Is it that like in like enough of us have agreed to that made up thing, therefore it is, and I think we know the answer is like
Right,
oppressive structures, but
right.
it's just funny to me because yeah, the obvious response I think to that is yes, everything is made up. So we can discount everything because it's made up, or we can value everything because it's made up.
Right.
Your choice.
I talk pretty incessantly, both on and off the show, about epistemic injustices, right? Like that is the root of a it's such a almost frighteningly insidious way of controlling a person. Is controlling like what they even have the ability to sort information into categories in their head about. And when these culture wars around this is made up, that's made up, or we shouldn't allow this, we shouldn't allow that, it really comes down to like you shouldn't be able to think this thought about yourself or another person. This is not a relevant construct whatsoever. And that's just like, it's so abstract, but it gets my blood boiling in a pretty visceral way. Like, how are
I
you
think,
threatened by someone calling themselves something?
yeah, and I think that like as a mathematician, something that just makes it really hard for me to do things like read the internet is that we start to argue about specific steps of like deriving an equation or specific steps of like manipulating variables when we have never started the conversation with defining variables. And I think that that's
Right.
like the core thing I've learned is before I'm going to get into a lively discussion with somebody, I want to understand how they're defining that word.
Yep.
Because if we go into the logic side of things, we are going to have such flawed logic. Like we can argue the logic and abstract the definitions forever, but if we don't fundamentally, if we're talking about two different concepts altogether, we could arrive at a perfectly lovely formula, but then realize at the end that we're actually working with completely different variables.
Plugging in the
So that
same
was
value, getting it. Yeah. And since you're talking about like the scientific method as applied to this, I think a lot about the ways that power structures show up in things like defining the null hypothesis, like talking about for folks who aren't aware of like the scientific method or experimentation, the null hypothesis is the result you expect to get. And it's usually talked about in very uncontroversial, benign terms. Like, I'm going to measure this thing. It would be really interesting if it wasn't zero. So the null hypothesis is that it's zero. But when we're talking like the discourse level now, a lot of people need like a reason why something should catch their attention or a reason why there needs to be a new word, or like, oh, we can't go towards this political system unless we prove that it's better than the other political system. Well, you've just set a null hypothesis right there. You've decided that this is the thing to beat, when that probably didn't win the same kind of war to become the thing that it was. It just is the way the world is because someone made it that way when no one was looking or couldn't fight back hard enough, and now it's the standard. But why is it the standard? Why can't that standard be challenged? So I pay attention to that in conversation a lot as well.
I think, yeah, two things that stand out to me in that are that the null hypothesis in conversation is typically equivalent to status quo, and people in
Right.
power determine status quo and determine that unless you can dethrone the null hypothesis, the way that we currently do things, the status quo, and have a perfect scientific result every single time, then it is not okay to dethrone the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis itself hasn't been rigorously tested
Right.
against something else.
Or hasn't been found wanting. Like, all right, our American capitalist system is leading the bottom of health outcomes. That's a measure right there. That's a line on a graph. So it's also about what values, not just what are your definitions of your variables, but what variables are you measuring? Is it just how personally rich you think you can be? Is it how much the people who like the system like you and you want to be like them? Always more to dig into.
And I think that the that aspect of power is so key to it, that not only is it the most powerful and elite people maintaining the null hypothesis, but they not only have like individual and systemic power, but then they also have like collective bargaining power in a way that it's gaslighting. It's like social gaslighting. Like, well, why would you try to come up with a new system that maybe does not yet have a name, when this system already exists? We've already been using it for so long. We're happy with it. What's wrong with you? It's your fault that it doesn't work for you. And I think that like logical jump is how we end up with such like individual shame over our lack of good job. Then you start to be like, I bad job because I bad job.
I bad job.
I bad job. I bad job, system good, I bad. So then you start to value your own self-worth, which is why at the beginning of stream I was very like pleased with myself for being good job and not
Right.
bad job.
Right. I mean, there's ways of these more viscerally tied to like I said, I like surviving, but the value part, the personal identity value part, and that like, I think that's still okay to an extent because I'm deciding to try and be good at the system. I could like get an RV and go live off the grid and care a lot about how good job, bad job I am. Technically, it'd be a hard thing, but I want to like change stuff. I want to like win hearts and minds. I want to like shift things as much as I can for the people who are here right now. And I've identified that a way to do that while continuing to feed myself is to good job. So good job for me is my friend Addison mentioned this. Like I like that if I do a good job, it means I potentially helped a lot of people. That's great, and that's your definition, right? Like good job to you means you fulfilled your own metrics. But it's still hard to disentangle, especially as a person who like I haven't looked good on paper, maybe not like ever, but if so, probably only fairly recently. And so there's that like, all right, the system's been bad job me, and so good job me means I get to think nice things about these goals that I'm trying to accomplish, my ability to accomplish them. There's a lot tied up in there.
I think that the fascinating thing about it is that for Addison, good job means something, and Addison gets to define what that is, but that I see the struggle we all have is that good job is given to us from a very young age, and maybe from guardians or parents or teachers or whatever, and they're also just touting a message from the workforce.
Right.
Like, did you make the money? And so then we spend our whole lives seeking like the good job stamp without knowing who gave the stamp, who defined what the stamp is. And at least for me, spending hours and days of my life in therapy trying to understand what does good job mean.
Right.
for me. And
Right.
would I call it good job, or would I call it like good try or
Right.
good effort
Good
or
iteration.
good survival day?
Right. Um, and yeah, it's inherently, I think, a deconstructive process to take that lingo and make it mean something that you want it to mean. Um, a thing that we were talking about discourse alongside the like uh, these words don't mean anything is I thought we were against labels. Why are we trying to label each other? Why are we trying to make so many categories? And then you got to talk about like, well, the label's just a flag. No one wants a flag like stuck in them, like colonized claim, like you have this label. But as a self-directed, guided thing, it can be really powerful because then other people can see that flag. Well, they're like, oh, you that flag, me that flag. Now we're all standing around the flag. Um, yeah,
I think I think that I've been thinking about this a lot, and how we when words not to be like so punny, but when words are self-defined, like the name of the dictionary I maintain, it is it is really powerful, because that's you taking that and you're finding aspects of your identity and giving a name to it as a way to acknowledge that exists. It goes back to what you said about sky blue and, ground, dirt. Like, that makes things real to us when we give them words, possibly because of the social nature of our species. The thing that I start to see a lot of the time is when a word gets taken away from the people that are using it for themselves and being used to project upon other people, that's when it becomes really like a label. And I'm making up like a non-existent dichotomy here for the sake of talking, but like it's like a label when you give it to someone else, but it's like a self-identifying term when it's yours. And we see, I think, in the way words evolve a lot, like the origins of the word BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. There's a lot of contention over whether it means Black, Indigenous people of color, as in Black and Indigenous people only, or if it means Black, comma, Indigenous, comma, if you respect the Oxford comma, and people of color. And I think a huge reason why that happened, beyond the fact that language is mutable and you know many other things, is that BIPOC started getting used by people that aren't BIPOC, whether that be Black, Indigenous people of color, or Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And what I start to see is that non-BIPOC people start to call um, anyone that they see as being non-white as BIPOC. They're like, oh, that's like the new term that replaces POC, people of color. And I guess the long way I'm explaining this is that words start to lose their meaning when they get taken, self-defined words often lose meaning, they lose nuance, they lose power when they go from the people who use them within the communities and are squishing out what they kind of all mean by it into the broader masses, who then apply like very brute logic to it. And I'm thinking of like other terms that kind of follow that. I don't know if you can think of any, but there's a lot, and I just can't happen to think of any in
I
this
mean, I
exact
think
moment.
a couple thoughts here. Like, yes, I've encountered lots of people who are personally like struggling with that divide of where to put the Oxford comma, if at all, in or the commas at all in BIPOC. And I think that's an interesting example because it is like the in-group out-group is sort of implicit in the label itself, depending on how you define the label. So someone who thinks the label applies to them could be using it in an out-group way, according to someone else who applies the label to them. I've also seen discourse around like don't say POC when you mean Black, and I think that sort of gets at a little bit of what you're talking about in terms of like the words are meant to identify an experience that is common with as much specificity as possible. Like, Black folks in our society here and everywhere have a much different experience than other people of color, but you dilute it if you just say this is a POC problem. And but in relating to when I think about, I don't know, I think this can work for and against benefit. Like some of the work I try to do in my own little like discourse activism is ungatekeep trans a little, and not in a way where I think it'd be unhealthy to be like, right, cis and trans are now canceled. Like this is a false dichotomy. Maybe it will be. Maybe it is a continuum to a lot of people. It's still very politically expedient to have a protected category that you can call certain things. But I think a lot of people are more genderqueer than they know. A lot of people are more like, and it's hard to say that about a person considering it's a self-defined thing. But my hunch, my hypothesis, is that more people identify on this spectrum than our current society allows us to realize. And so by like allowing that label to be a little wobbly applied, you're actually doing a service, I think, in some ways to the movement as a whole. Although there are other people who, like trans medicalists, for example, who like think the exact opposite. This loses power if other people get to use it. So that's really interesting.
And I think that that's like, as somebody who like cis doesn't describe me, but I also feel tremendous discomfort with identifying as trans because I do feel like I'm like removing power from people who feel more squarely in that term. And so like genderqueer makes sense to me as like an in between, because like identifying as cis is basically saying that you associate with your birth gender. And it's like, well, if you don't like believe in gender as a binary, like you're kind of already hosed in my mind. And so then I don't identify with that. So where does that leave me? And it leaves me in this like vacuum in between. But trying to tread very carefully in that I also don't want to take away power from people. But I think that concept of power is really interesting. And I think in many aspects, we still operate under a very a scarcity mindset with regards to power, that we are fighting one another for power, scraps of power, when power is so heavily hoarded at the top.
Right. But at the same time, I wouldn't trust a person who's like, I don't know. Sorry, continue with your point.
Oh, it's okay. I think just to finish the thought is that I think that hoarding power at the top, but then we also can't make that a binary of like, well, we only fight the top, that there is a lot of power nuance, particularly when you're talking to like two multiply marginalized people who are marginalized on different axes. It's like
Right.
you both hold power over each other in different contexts, and you can try to quantify, like, you know, whether being trans or disabled or um, black or indigenous or whatever, you can try to measure it, but then you start getting into really weird quantifications of things that shouldn't be quantified, which in my mind is basically like eugenics. So
Right.
hard pass on
Yeah.
eugenics
And a
adjacent
commentary like,
things.
is power zero sum? Well, no. Like that's where the concept of intersectionality comes from. But here's a here's a scenario like, okay, I'm a trans person talking to another trans person. That person is trans and disabled, and they're like, hey, I need some disability accommodations up in this, and I'm like, look, like, why are we trying to further divisions within the trans community? That's what they want us to do. They want us to fight. They want us to pick for scraps, like all the things that you said, but it can be applied in an oppressive way. And I think you have to look outside you too. Like, are you saying this thing? And a lot of really powerful people would agree with you. Well, you're being a vector of oppression at that moment with that sentiment. So you always have to think about like, who are you speaking for? You can be saying the same things, but if what you're saying benefits someone who benefits from oppression, then you too are promoting that oppression in that like either we shouldn't be divided or we should be divided. Really just comes down to the needs of the people in that conversation.
And I think that's something that's really hard for all of us to reconcile, is that when we don't actively fight it, we are all vectors of oppression for all of the privileges we hold, and sometimes even ones that we don't, that we have adjacency to or we have loyalty to, like being Vietnamese American. I have adjacency to whiteness because of literal policy changes that happened, that removed the Chinese Exclusion Act and removed other like oppressive literal American policies that made it so that we had more of the same privileges that white people intrinsically had in the law. And so I think, I don't know, that was kind of a self tangent that I distracted myself from. But I think that we don't like to admit that we are perpetuating oppressive power structures when we don't pay attention.
Right.
It's like, great. So I have a day where I'm a little spaced out, maybe I'm having trouble focusing, and you're saying that my actions can then be oppressive. It's like, well, yeah, sorry, but yeah.
Right. And I think that's only like a hard hitting truth if you have yet to acknowledge that we're like it's kind of impossible. Not in a way where we shouldn't be trying as much as possible, but it's impossible to, I don't know, unless you try to remove yourself from society entirely, which I think is also the doing nothing. We're always living in some form of oppressing someone else, being oppressed in varying degrees, of course. It's just like how low can you get that percentage every day? How much entropy have you reversed with your actions on a rolling average? If that makes you feel better, like we have to let ourselves breathe. We have to acknowledge like on the days I try harder to do right by veganism, I may recycle less well. Like we're not operating on the carbon credit system here. We have a finite amount of energy. The world makes it very hard to be good, makes it hard to be good job at good person. Um, and we make the gains where we can. We make the effort where we can. But even that statement can't be like a, it's okay to be complacent. These are just layers and layers and layers and layers.
I think that that note is something, and I appreciate you phrasing it in such a clear way that I really struggle with. That I think, yes, of course, capitalism and white supremacy and colonialism are trying to make it make the systemic problems they've created individual responsibility to
Cognitively
fix.
difficult to overcome.
Yes, because they know that individually we can't actually solve it, and they're causing far more harm than we are, even as collective individuals, like as
Right.
the collective, the people. But I also think that if we allow that, like when people just throw back the phrase, there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, which is absolutely true, I worry that we like almost abstract ourselves too far, because at the end of the day, corporate structures, power, all that, corporations aren't a thing. It's people. It's groups of people that have power. And so if we as individuals allow ourselves to do that, it's almost like the BIPOC word stealing thing, right? People in power then like, well, as an individual CEO of Amazon, there's not a lot I can do. I
Right.
can't break the system as an individual CEO of Amazon. Like, what am I going to do? It's up to the people. And it's like, all right, well, see, that's when your logic can be used against you. So I think like for me at least, and not speaking for others, my constant um, justice, what is that thing, a scale that's what it's commonly known as, words. I try to balance that concept of what are my values, where do I want to place my energy, where do I get personal gratitude. I mean, let's be real, we like to feel good.
Right.
Like, we like good job, we like feel good. So
Right.
I want to do things that feel like good to me, and so at the end of the day I'm going to try to do things that feel good to me that I think are helping other people. And that's how I weigh my good job on the anti-capitalist, non-drone good job side.
Right. On my personal pie chart of when I deploy, there's no ethical consumption of capitalism. It's like 100% in the drive-through line at Taco Bell and 0% gunning for a promotion at Palantir. You know?
Can I please make a shirt of that and send all the proceeds to you and your efforts, because
Sure.
I love Taco Bell.
I mean, me too, but in an
Is that something
acceleration.
you're allowed to admit?
I mean, I like it in an accelerationist, ironic, nihilist sort of way. Like they will probably be the first to invent like a new form of matter, and like yeah, you can get it on your cheesy tacos now. Um, and this is going back to the like, uh, I hate this. Like, are we allowed to admit it? I don't know. Could we get canceled from this? I don't know. Do I think cancellation is worth worrying about? No. Do I worry about it anyway? Sometimes. Um, but we're not perfect all the time. And just as we were saying, like there's ways to be not perfect and use it to excuse awful things, and not perfect and use it to like keep your meat sack going. Yeah, I don't have energy to feed myself all night. Sometimes I want to just go get some crunchy tacos, like only fast food that I can actually eat that is gluten free and vegan. My body decided can't do either of those things, um, and so I let myself have that. I don't try to do it all the time. Um, yeah, it's about balance for sure.
And I think that another aspect of this, I actually really like this Taco Bell example because I think it helps to make it clear in my mind. It's also making me want Taco Bell. But
Wouldn't say that about
at the same,
Chick-fil-A, mind you.
same no. um, I I think that like that idea is like you also aren't, loudly on the internet proclaiming that Taco Bell is in fact a good corporation that
Right,
everyone should support, and that like if people want to really pick a bad fast food, your fast food is a good fast food. Taco Bell good,
right.
Chick-fil-A bad. I think that I see a lot of that, and I always personally feel cringe when I feel like people are defending corporations because again, corporations are made up
Right,
and they're backed by people. And so I just think it's really weird to like go to bat for a corporation. I
right.
just think that's
Well, that gets
like
in
for
that
me, I'm like, I don't get it.
there's that private public divide too, where it's like I make assessments all the time. Like I'll acknowledge it. Sometimes I watch media that is a little transphobic. As a trans person, I feel like it's my right to decide in that moment, do I feel like engaging with this? Do I get value out of this in excess of how shitty I may feel watching this? What are my own lines around, am I going to donate money to this creator? Am I going to pay them to consume this or not? Those aren't calls I can make for anyone else. Now, you could look at that just through the lens of cancellation and say, okay, this person is like doing things in private that could get them canceled, but they would never talk about them publicly. But you look at it through the lens of discourse and power, and it's like, I am also not promoting this at all. I'm not saying anyone can do it or should do it. And I'm not going to say like what I engage with here or there on my personal decision basis. So, yeah, like I acknowledge that I'm not going to get everything right. I acknowledge I have to take care of myself. I acknowledge that sometimes I allow myself to enjoy things that I don't want to exist, but they exist. So I'm going to allow myself to enjoy them a little bit. And I'm also not going to prescribe that or defend it or die in those hills or be a vector for its continued survival in the world.
I think that that's such a critical thing is like I think that it's easy for us to forget is I see this a lot is that people trying so hard to do right by things are moral absolutionists. I try to define all the words that I use because
Sure.
I can talk really pretentiously sometimes. I blame it on having a liberal arts degree. But moral absolution, like basically the idea that everything is like good or evil or morally good or bad, good job, bad job. And like the only way we could, like you're saying, is almost like to sit somewhere. I don't know where, certainly not on any colonized land because you'd be participating in colonization merely by existing on colonized land if it weren't your land to begin with, and not partaking in society. But that's become rendered impossible with how developed humans have made this entire earth. And so by trying to do as little as possible, you are then allowing status quo to take over. You're not resisting anything. You're just allowing the powers that be to like almost reign on you in an effort to do right by doing nothing. And so I think like the reconciliation I have is to like do as little harm as I can, yes, throughout the day by, like you're saying, not vectorizing things that are harm, but then also like trying to see the nuance and things like the TV example, I think is really good too. Like I wish I could find a TV show that wasn't trans music or Islamic music or xenophobic or whatever. I don't know why I changed xena music. I guess to keep my language
No,
clear.
yeah,
But
that's good.
but like it's not possible because it's like embedded in all of the writers. And so I just it's so futile to me to be like, oh, don't watch that show anymore because X, Y, or Z. That's a decision you can only make on an individual basis. Is this causing me so much harm? Is this infiltrating my brain with thoughts that society already is perpetuating in my brain and I want to actively stop that? Maybe. Or maybe a better approach for you is to go ahead and watch it and to actively engage and to reflect on how those are those systems at play. That's how I choose to consume media because I just like sometimes I just like really shitty TV. I have my Taco Bell, I have my shitty TV, and it's like I have a dumpster day to myself. Like
I have a hard time with media sometimes because I'm here for the escapism. I'm living in the news cycle. I'm living in ongoing awful things that are happening all the time, and I want to escape, but I also don't feel comfortable entirely escaping. Like I like media that talks about real stuff, that talks about like real issues, but maybe not always in a very like personal way, or even a way. And I feel mixed about this, but in a way where like it doesn't affect me personally, but affects people I'm close to. That still takes out of my bucket to like, all right, we're talking about real shit and oppression that's happening here today, right now, in a way that I might see on the news tomorrow. I don't always have energy for that. But I'm happy to find escapist media that still talks about power, that still talks about making a better society, etc. I don't just want pure fantasy all the time. I can't really turn off that part of my brain anyway, and I don't want to. But at least like give it something less meaty to chew on sometimes.
Something I found monumentally helpful, and not that profound, is just journaling after I consume media and being able to just give myself 30 minutes, 45 minutes, or some shows now are hour and 25 minutes. What is with that? It's like advertising. I know it's because of advertising, but still, gonna
Don't like
ask a
an hour and a half
hypothetical. What's with
classes.
that?
Don't like hour and a half TV shows. Give me 2 hours. Give me 3 hours. Give me 1 hour. Give me 30 minutes.
An hour and 25 minutes, I think, is the rudest time interval that there is. Period. But with that, like, I'll watch something, I'll give myself the time span of it is. And then after I'll be like, all right, what did I get out of that? And it makes it active, but it gives me that moment to not have my brain is already on when I don't want it to be, when I'm trying to fall asleep, etc. So I don't need it to continue to be like that all the time. So giving myself that, all right, well, watch this, but then write about it and see how you feel about it. What did you notice?
Right.
It's like the compromise I strike myself. I think we're just always making compromises, like just all the time. Moral compromising is my existence.
Right. Like there's no, you've seen a lot of conversations about people who are trying to encounter their privilege and engage with their privilege. I think a big mistake people make cognitively is thinking that there's any combination of things you can say and do that just make you good job morally, like good person, that you can't just become a good person. And that is really hard to I don't know if you can fully be a good person. And every time I even use those terms, I'm aware that they're like really fragile abstractions that are very specific to the moment. You can't erase the harm that you do by existing. You can't erase the harm that you do in your moments of weakness, and you can't erase the harm that you do even when you're focusing on something that is seen as a moral good over there, just because you don't have energy left or time or being left to focus on all the other things you could be doing as well. It's inherently about harm reduction. Existence is just all about harm reduction.
And I think that it's not even, I don't think it's a hot take, but maybe it is, whatever. Hot take, cancellation, all those terms once had a meaning in specific communities and then became overused in broader communities, and then and then deemed as overused. That's back to the earlier topic. But I think that the good person, bad person dichotomy comes up so much as a defense for oppressive actions and words. That when someone does something or says something that is anti-Black or anti-queer, then all of a sudden you have people defending that person's moral honor, that like they've been a good person. And the missing part is to me,
Right.
or by my definition. But I think it's really dangerous because once you deem someone as a good or bad person, where do they go? They've been placed into these buckets. Then what? Is it that once you're a good person, you can never do anything wrong again? And you'll be defended by your fans forever? If you're a bad person, can you never crawl out of that bucket? And is there no level of like forgiveness for you? That's just like, it's so pointless. So
Yeah.
for me, it's like, what harm did that last action take? And I think we can judge people based on their history and based on their growth and the context of things. And being able to say the last 13 things you said were very deeply rooted in anti-trans mentality. So that gives me pause wanting to interact
Right.
with you.
Right.
but instead we say good or bad person, and then it
Right.
becomes like a moral assessment, and then it's like we try to have tests for moral, and then again
Right.
it goes back to eugenics and like testing weird things that can't be
Right.
tested.
And
So
I'll go a step further and say I judge people by the moment at, like you just said, like to no one, like, oh, the last 13 things you said were really like awful in some way. Well, that's now a point. You've potentially resolved this epistemic injustice at a very local level. You've let them know that their actions had this impact. You've let them know that perhaps their intent and impact have diverged. What do they do then next? Do they completely change their behavior? Do they double down? Do they wiggle out of it? Do they just keep doing those things? And that's just your personal engagement with them. I think a lot of people skate by doing pretty awful things because each person thinks they're the first person to let them know that behavior had a harmful impact. And they're like, cool, thank you. And then they just keep on going about their life. Maybe they don't like harm that person or do that thing in that person's presence again. But yeah, I want to judge people by their actions and also their apparent like willingness to engage with the impact of their actions. And that really is like, those actions still happen. They still caused harm. That harm can't be absolved, especially if you were not the person harmed. But you can make an assessment of, is this person trying to crawl out of whatever moral hole I might see them as being in, or are they just keeping on trucking?
and I think that with that idea, we don't have very good models for language. And I think that's why I like watching so much TV and focusing on, I think, like what you said, shows where we start to see modeling behavior for difficult conversations between friends, like that I've had. When a friend has um, said something like deeply racist, and being able to navigate that conversation. There's not a lot of models for that, especially through media, through TV. So I think that it's not a reason or an excuse, but I think we don't have a lot of good models for that. So we evade it, right? Like that when we do something wrong, instead of learning how to say, you're right, I haven't considered that. Thank you for letting me know. I need to do some more reading, or I need to do some more introspection and adjust. Um, and then to adjust, we instead like double down because it's easier. We know how to do that. We know how to fight. We know how to get into these morally complex
The risk is being a
conversations.
bad person.
Yes.
That
And
dichotomy harms everyone.
yes. Instead of just being like, no, I'm a deeply flawed, and I know this is longer than me good and me bad, but like instead of being like,
Deeply
I
flawed
am
and trying
a
hard.
yeah, deeply flawed, trying hard, fucking up all the time, but willing to admit that I'm wrong a lot, a little too long, I guess. But I just wish we had more models for it, and that we could model that behavior for each other more. And honestly, like, pro tip for every person with any amount of celebrity, it's like just admitting you're wrong. People forget after, and that the only reason people get so much attention for their mistakes is because that moment you're saying, in that moment when all the spotlight's on them, they are so afraid of just having that slightly embarrassing apology or whatever, and an
Yeah.
ownership over their actions. It's
Full on
it's
scarcity
it's not that
mentality.
hard.
You'll lose it
Yes.
all because you can't risk any of your reputation. Um, I want to shift a little bit. I'm willing to take a 60-second break if you want to. I want you to be really honest. Yeah? No?
I don't need a break, but if
Okay,
you would
we can
like
keep
one,
going.
happy to take it.
Well,
Okay.
we've been circling around. We've been talking about words the whole time, which is what I adore about you and in general. And we were talking about labels a little while ago. A thing that's been on my mind since is talking about like that dichotomy between labels being self-assigned versus being applied to people. We've been talking about gender. It makes me think about how cisgender is such a threatening word to some people, and I think it's because it is a word that punches up in like by describing a power hierarchy that is traveling down. And I think that for a lot of people, there aren't very many times in their life they've experienced a cultural moment where they have a label assigned to them that describes a thing that they are or do that they don't personally identify and agree with. And I don't think of that in like a turnabout is fair play sort of thing. I think that is this, to identify your own marginalization and oppression, sometimes you have to be able to identify where that marginalization and oppression is coming from. That's just the thing that's been on my mind. I think it's interesting that people get so threatened. It's not surprising that people have weird reactions to that word, I think, because it is an example of a community describing other people in the process of describing themselves as well. I'm not sure how avoidable that is. I don't think it needs to be avoided, personally.
Yeah, and I think that the other aspect of it is that this actually makes me think about like the deep like thing I think about a lot, which is like until hetero people have to come out, I have no interest in being regulated about what sorts of disclosure about my orientation need to happen. And I think that that's kind of the same idea, right? That like they have never, and I should say, we have never had to think about the privileges that we had and which systems that we benefit from. And so being labeled by it when it is the null hypothesis um, is like alarming because that forces us as people that have had society built for us and our convenience to assess like, wait, does this word actually describe me? And I think that's where the fear comes from is, oh, like, you get people like Googling like, what is cis? And then they have to like reconcile with like, oh, does that actually describe me? I'm not sure. And then that's icky because there's internalized transmedia involved and all of this stuff. But like, we're just really afraid to deeply look within ourselves and how we perpetuate bad. We really like to perpetuate good, but we don't like to perpetuate bad, so we avoid it because we don't know how to not perpetuate it.
Right. This is not saying that being cis or straight or any of those things is bad, um, but upholding the impact they have on people who are not those things can be, and simply doing nothing about it can also be. But we've been circling around this for a while, and I really want to talk about your project, Self-Defined. I was so enamored with it when I first saw it. Do you want to talk a little bit about what it is and how it factors into all the things we've been talking about?
Yeah, so self-defined is a dictionary. It's at selfdefined.app. That is a community driven dictionary for people to really define themselves. And as much as possible, I try to get folks who actually identify with the terms or who are most impacted by the oppression, if we're talking about oppressive structures, to write those terms. And I think people might wonder, like, why would you make another dictionary when so many are so prolific? But it really made me think about like dictionaries are just written by people over time who has power to define words. And I think words are very impactful. I think we like to diminish the power of words a lot of the time. And to say like, words don't mean anything, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words may never hurt me. Well, I think that words do have tremendous emotional impact around people self-identifying and finding community and understanding themselves, but it also has material impact on policy and laws. And so to diminish words, I think, is a bit short-sighted. But yeah, self-defined is a way to try to combat that by creating a dictionary that acknowledges nuance as well. Dictionary definitions tend to be a bit dry, and while they can list, 3 or 4 different understandings of terms, there's not a lot of unpacking about why terms matter, why terms are harmful, and it also attempts to be objective. That it might include a racial slur and say that it is a slur, but it doesn't break down the impact of it and what systems are in play for that. And I, as a word nerd, really love the ability to like get people to think about terms that we use very regularly, especially in business, like grandfather clause or peanut gallery or powwow or like any number of terms that we're working through, and to really stop themselves and be like, oh, I've actually never looked up that word. I'm going to take a minute to look up that word. And I love nuance, and I know you do too. So the dictionary is tremendously uh, challenging and rewarding because you start to get into like really gray areas about like the pronoun entry, I think is the perfect example. In pronouns, I wrote that, and it is very long. It talks about how pronoun order can have impact, how pronouns not related to gender, how you shouldn't call them preferred pronouns, how you don't need to call them personal pronouns, you just need to call them pronouns, how pronouns might be specific to a situation, that sometimes I default to she in a situation that I don't feel safe, nor I feel the energy to talk about like my gender. It's just easier, and that's not where I choose to place my energy today. And so, like, understanding that pronouns are context based. So, really, you should just ask someone, what pronouns should I use for you today on this stream, in this brochure that's going to be printed out that your weird parents might see, whatever. That entry took forever to write, and it's literally about pronouns. Which seems like it should be simple right now. Most of us are starting to add pronouns in various places and things.
Right.
So I love the dictionary because it is a place to explore to the best of our ability nuance. But it's tough. Like you can. I think the biggest thing I've learned from dictionary is that you cannot find consensus. It's just about finding a way to address the very multifaceted way that these words, particularly ones that are evolving, are used within communities.
And
And the
it's
whole go ahead,
go
sorry.
ahead.
I was just going to say that the whole point of this was to reduce emotional labor on marginalized people, to um, like really have to define terms that there are some communal and common understandings of it. You'll send them a link. One of the future goals I have is to create like a query or a parameter that you can append to it. So you could say, you know, I identify as a, you know, gender queer, non-binary Vietnamese American, and that could be concatenated into a string that you could put into your
Ooh,
bio, and then
like
people could
pronoun
go
island.
and just, yeah, exactly. And you could just go to that page and you would see all the things that define me. And so then that's allowing me to take ownership of my own identity, and taking some emotional burden of all the questions that people feel entitled to ask and to have answered.
I think there's something really radical and subversive and powerful about using the platform in the form of a dictionary as a way of empowering different groups of people as culture makers in the ways that, I mean, people are culture makers all the time and are still marginalized, but in the same way that whoever at Merriam-Webster, I like Merriam-Webster, fine dictionary, just fine, but they still get to decide what is a word and what is not, what has entered the zeitgeist enough to become a word. And just making that decision, my dictionary, our dictionary, is full of the things that the words that we find relevant, whether or not they're in the dictionary, and the definitions that we find relevant, whether or not those are the definitions in the dictionary. And with this pronoun article you mentioned specifically, I'm wondering if you've, how often you run into this tension of like self-defined as a like style guide or as a radical copy editing manual versus just as a like, not just, but as a catalog of what these things mean and maybe how they harm versus also the like instruction on how to use them properly. Can you speak
It's
to that?
it Yeah, I think it's something that I'm challenged with, and scope is always the question I get asked, especially by new engineers that want to come. It's an open source dictionary, I should mention, so
Are you
it's
accepting
community
PRs right now?
driven. Always.
Sweet.
And issues, and also if someone's not into using Git, they can always like tweet or email. There's ways to submit without having to use those technologies. But I think that what I run into is questions about scope. So what words are okay, what words are not okay, what falls under the name of self-defined. And I think to some degree you have to allow oppressive dictionary or oppressive terms, you know, because they do define how we define ourselves, right? Like we're resisting that. But in questions of scope, like with the pronoun thing, it was kind of like, I do think that at its core it is to like provide definitions, but I think that where I saw dictionaries are lacking, and maybe it is more of a dictionary style guide, is that like when someone reads a definition for what pronouns is, maybe they're given a little bit of guidance about don't use preferred pronouns, just use pronouns and things like that, they start to ask a lot of questions. And if the whole point of this dictionary is to reduce emotional load on marginalized people, I try to write entries and edit entries in a way that anticipate some of those questions and allow for the nuance that those aren't the set end all be all guidances, and to link them out to additional resources where things are written about more extensively, so that again that emotional labor goes on the person who's asking all of the questions. So it does fall a bit more into a style guide in some entries in particular. I mean, a
But that
true
makes so much
dictionary, I don't.
sense. Co- Compared to like with that top level goal that you set. Like people who don't know words, there's not a certain group of people who are always asked to define words for people. But marginalized folks are in that like copy editors of the world kind of position all the time.
And we're asked to speak as a monolith, and I think that's as much as possible trying to use each definition or dictionary entry as a way to show how non-monolithic everything really is, and how like you're not going to get all the answers from this dictionary, nor would that ever be my goal. But I want it to give enough and a rich enough answer that you leave away with that being like, wow, this is a lot more nuanced than I initially understood. I'm going to go read more about it if I'm interested.
That is so rare and good. Like I see people asking for resources about all sorts of things, and the like me in me wants to be like, cool, well, I'll put together a link list for you. And I rarely have the time to actually do that. And it's always about so many different things. But this seems like a really great resource that you can point people to, and they can click around, they can explore, get a sense of the world outside themselves and the sides of the world that they know that they don't know. Like I know a lot of these words, but I didn't know they meant this, or I didn't know they meant this to these people, or they mean so many things to so many different people. So this is a fantastic project.
Thank you. I think that it's also really nice for um, being able to receive and to be open to terms that may actually give us a bit of a space in the world to be like, oh wow, like biromantic describes how I feel. That's interesting. I never thought of myself as being gay or queer. And yet here I am faced with this term. And I think anywhere we can remind, I think nuance is just a tool for educating about the spectral nature of things, right? Nuance is like continuing to wedge its way into every binary that we create, and that's what I'm really hoping to do is to help us understand gender, race, ethnicity, um, disability, all of those terms along the ways that we identify ourselves as more of a spectrum.
I think that
So
really
that
goes back to the sorry, gathering thoughts. I think that goes back to the ways that ungatekeeping can be a really radical act. Like I can tell you that as a person who does not identify fully with your assigned gender at birth, I consider you trans. You can do with that what you want. Someone else may come along who is like more firmly in that camp in a societal way and say that you're not. And that only does so much for you, right? It depends on the people around you. But if I can say this because you said it about yourself. Hey, Tatiana, you might be genderqueer. Go look about that word. Now you can say, all right, I don't have to think about being trans. I can think about being genderqueer. And then I can say, I also put genderqueer under the trans umbrella. And that's a different kind of thing to engage with, I think, than just letting the people on one side of the gate decide, like yes or no, by their invisible criteria. It's empowering people to find the words that do apply to them and then let them chew on that for a while. And then think about, like, all right, biromantic, or I'm like demi romantic or demisexual. Well, now I'm like edging into ace spec discourse, and I'm thinking more about other marginalized sexualities, and it all comes from just having a relatively non controversial word to describe who you are.
Yeah, and when you feel safe in, I think that that's really underrated in a lot of this is that safety always needs to be factored into this. And so if you find something that identifies with you that you feel safe saying out loud to people, I think that that has a lot of um, empowerment in it, for me at least.
Yeah,
And so, yeah, that's why genderqueer makes sense to me because I feel like that helps me to not feel like I'm taking away from others and also from myself, that I'm able to sit somewhere in between.
that's why I lean a lot on mixed pronoun discourse. Like, you don't need to decide if you're trans. You don't even need to decide that being they, she, they, in whatever order makes you trans. But pronouns are a thing that people use to talk about you. So how do you want them to talk about you? Like, there's a lot connected there, and that's just one entry point to thinking about your identity in that way.
I think that your Twitter thread, which has for good reasons, gone multiply viral multiple times
Thanks.
about pronouns, was such a helpful read for me because a lot of the things that you covered were things I hadn't considered. A lot of them were things that I had toyed with in my own mind, but wasn't able to articulate. But how, yeah, sometimes, and it also really did radically. So thank you, inform the way I wrote the pronoun entry
Oh,
in the
thanks.
dictionary. But just the nuance that you addressed in that you were like, some people use it for this, some people don't. Some people use it for this, some people don't. And that's really like what it comes down to, it is not expecting monoliths and not protecting the gate on either side.
Thank you. Thank you for that reflection. We started a little late, so I'm okay ending a little late, but I do want to respect your
Sure.
time and wrap up here. First, I want to say thanks to Not Safe for Wonks and Not Safe Media for allowing this show to happen on their network with this nice StreamYard tool. You can find them on youtube.com/notsafemedia, NSF Wonks on Twitter, and patreon.com/notsafe. Some of the shows are on hiatus right now. The organizers and show creators are taking a little break because they work really, really hard. They're also involved in local Georgia politics, but fantastic group of people, great leftist content on there. This is just one of the shows. We got everything from Power Rangers to what's happening on the ground, all produced by people who you can be pretty sure that you won't hate at the end of their show for whatever reason. And also huge thank you to Tatiana Mac on Twitter and elsewhere as Tatiana T Mac, patreon.com/Tatiana Mac, and kofi.com/Tatiana Mac. Send them some money so we can continue surviving in the ways that we try to survive. Anything else that you want to promote or mention before we sign off?
No, I just really appreciate you inviting me for a one-on-one. This is way better than all the capitalist one-on-ones I've ever had to do in my life. So thank you, Ada, for hosting the show and for all the insightfulness. And just, as always, you are one of the very few people that I know who just really likes to sit in the nuance couch. So glad to be here on the nuance couch with you.
Thank you. We didn't even get into like software engineering versus design, all the various ways you engage in the world. You're one of the most complex, thoughtful, talented, skilled people. And there's lots of skilled people in the world, but not that many people who are skilled at that nuanced process and about really wielding things that people value in a normative way to do non-normative movements with. I appreciate you so much. Very thankful to you for this. The time flew by. Wish we could do it longer, but maybe we'll just have to do it more often. Thank you. Thank you all for listening and watching. And yeah, take care. Ending the broadcast now. I think we're done. Maybe, maybe not.
I always just sit still, like, and not breathe.
I had to get a document.
Oxygen to the brain.
I had to get a document notarized the other day online, and the person was like, "All right, we're done," because you have to be on video chat, and then the software was having issues, so they were like, "All right," and we just like paused. And after like 20 seconds, he had to acknowledge, like, "Yeah, I'm still. Broadcast isn't ending." Well, you can drop whenever you want. Otherwise, I'm just gonna click on this button and see what happens. I'm hotspotting off my phone right now, so.
Oh wow. My headphones just died, so I think that's my universal cue to run. But thank you so much for the lovely conversation. So good to talk to you. Take care.
You too. Take care, Tatiana. Bye.
Bye.
Turning off Wi-Fi, turning Wi-Fi back on. This is going to be edited out if this ever makes it to podcast form.